You'll actually currently have both.
Okay.
Great.
I mean, they'll be listening.
Well, welcome everyone. My name is
Just
Todd
gonna be
Lincoln,
like, there you
Director
go.
of Collection Services here at the Carlos. I am joined by a number of my colleagues, so I'm going to suggest introduce themselves one by one. Start with Renee.
I'm Renee Stein. I'm the Chief Conservator here at the Carlos.
I'm Jessica Betts-Abel, and I am a fellow conservator here at the Carlos.
I'm Annie Shanley. I'm the Assistant Registrar.
I'm Andy McKenzie. I'm the Works on Paper Curator.
I'm Brittany Deneen. I'm the Assistant Conservator. And I'm Stacy Gannon Wright. I'm the Associate Registrar and Collections Manager.
And so, as I think most of you know, our presentation today is what we learned from and basically how we coped and made it through a flooding event that occurred in our ground floor storage areas just about this time last year. It was June of 2018. So I will turn it over to Tina C2, who will give some opening remarks for HERA.
Okay. I'll just come stand there.
Yeah, stand at the podium maybe,
Sure.
if you like.
Okay. I just want to make a few quick announcements, but welcome. Again, I'm Tina C2, and I'm the co-chair with Christine Wiseman of the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance. Thank you. This is our yearly education program. I wanted to point out that we are going to be sending around an attendance. If you could just put your name on it, it helps us to know how many people were here. And we're a no-profit. We don't even have a 501c3. So if you want to be a member, it's free. Just indicate on the thing you want more information, and we'll send you something with our sign-up list. We tend to bring our membership forms. But we do have a brochure handy for anyone who hasn't seen it, and that does have links to how to find us on the interweb. For those of you who are members, you might have gotten an email that we were doing a communications test. It's kind of bright over here. And that is our yearly communications test. It's one so that we can make sure that our listserv is working, that we don't have a lot of bad email addresses, but it's also a way for you to answer that email and make sure that our contact information for you is correct. And we've already seen quite a bit of people put in changes, and it's also our way of communicating if there is a disaster and we need to figure out who can help or if anyone needs help. So if you haven't, we're going to send out a reminder, right, this week? Already went out. Okay, you don't miss that. Deadline is Friday. Deadline is Friday. Please try to get that and your changes. I also wanted to plug some new additions to our resource page. Jessica Lemming, who's newly dubbed Communications Committee Chair of one, has enhanced our resources section to include emergency managers for most of the metro Atlanta area and kind of environs. And so one, check it to see if yours is on there. And also two, if you know emergency managers or agencies that are not in that list, please let us know and we can add them. Two more things. In June, the Georgia Public Library Service is hosting, or we're actually co-hosting a webinar. It's Georgia's Weather, a year in review and what to expect. And it is going to be Will Langston. He's the meteorologist for GEMA. I'm not going to go into the full name of the agency, but he's going to talk about hurricanes and other bad weather last year and how they're going to be, what we can expect this year. So that should be a good webinar. It's on Thursday, June 27th at 2 p.m. And there is a link to that on our Facebook page. And that does require you to go and sign up for the webinar. And the last one is the FAIC Foundation for American Institute for Conservation has received a grant, and they are going to be doing some regional response team training in Savannah. and that we're excited that they picked us to help them run that. There will be an application process for that. It'll start in the fall for about 35 to 40 participants, we think. And then, but signing up for that, you're committing to do some online coursework and then a face-to-face session in Savannah in early spring of 2020. And there will likely be some funding available for travel expenses. So another great reason to like us on Facebook is we will be putting out information on that and on our website. And that's all I have.
Okay.
Thank you, Todd.
Start. I have to head podium for our first dramatics.
One piece in wet winter, pull away from the wall, and then maybe we can grab it. I couldn't get the ball.
It doesn't look as dramatic in the video
No, it doesn't.
as it felt in real life.
Well, and I should point out too that little squeak you heard was Annie almost falling to her death on the floor.
Yeah,
But
Yeah,
she survived and
it was
kept the
slippery.
camera running in the
I
process.
did. Yeah.
Well, and the sort of shh that you heard in the background was the water
That was the
pouring
water pouring.
in.
Yeah.
That was the water pouring in.
All right, so let's start.
Again.
Okay, so let's start with what happened. You want to start, Andy?
Sure. So I was back in Works on Paper Storage with our contracting Works on Paper conservator, Liz Schulte. It was kind of unusual for us to be down there that late. It was around, a little after 4:30, I think.
Yeah.
And we were working on the Warhol show that was up in the fall. So it was good that we were back there. It was a really rainy day. The weather had gotten worse and worse. And we suddenly heard this roar, I think you could call it. It was pretty alarming. I'd never heard anything like that down there before. Liz thought, well, maybe it's rain, and really it's very strange. I've never heard anything like this. So I started walking up to the front of our storage area, and on the left is this box that you see in that video, water coming out of. And you don't, from that video, get a sense of how much water there was. I mean, it was literally a fire hydrant just spewing on top of that cabinet from that box.
Yeah, I can say, I mean, I walked in well after the fun started.
Yeah.
And I was looking at a column of water 4 inches in diameter that was extending 4 inches from the wall before it dropped to hit the floor. So that was how much pressure was behind the spout of water.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it had blown the box open,
Yep,
blown the
off.
cabinet open. So when I saw the water, I told Liz what had happened. She immediately ran to alert everybody else who was there. And luckily, again, I mean, it's later in the day, and we just
Yeah.
happened to have a lot of people there.
Yeah,
which was
Renee,
great.
Renee, myself, and Todd were in the conservation lab, which is down the hall from storage, and we were having a conversation, and I actually heard the water,
Yeah.
but I thought the loading dock door was open.
Mhm.
Like, I thought that was the only logical conclusion, and then all of a sudden you just hear Liz Schulte, Todd, Todd, and that's when we knew something tragic had happened.
Yeah. I stupidly tried to shut the box over top of the water, which obviously did not work. By the time I'd gotten off of the table, everyone had arrived to help.
And from my quick head notes that I scribbled down, the rain essentially stopped by about 5:30. That was the point at which the water stopped pouring in. But by that point, there was, at the deepest place on the floor, almost 2 inches of water. Which is actually where you see here with the boxes. Our storage areas begin with an area for 3-dimensional artwork, and then you go through a doorway, and that's where you hit the Works on Paper storage area, but it is actually slightly lower in grade, so the water found its way downhill to the Works on Paper storage area, which is what you're looking at here. These were some boxed frames from an exhibition that had closed previously that needed to go to the storage warehouse.
I can just say a few more things about what happened right after that.
Yeah, I mean, so the next bit we were going to talk about was basically, okay, what do we do for the initial response? So basically day of,
Right.
day after. So yeah, if you want to start and then the other two.
Sure. So once everybody got there, I felt comfortable that they could take over that part of it. I was really concerned about, I know that that area is lower back there, and we had some archival materials and things on the floor, and also packing material. We had several boxes on the lower level, and I didn't know at that point how much water would come in. It didn't seem to be stopping. So what Liz and I did was immediately get all of the boxes that contain works on paper and put them on top of the flat files in the center of storage. We moved all the archival materials also on top of the flat files just to get, I think we did the bottom 2 levels, just to get everything away as much as we could. And if we saw that it was going to continue to rise, we would continue to do that. Yeah.
You can, the flat file she's speaking of, you can see just barely in that
Oh, yeah.
long shot there, and he is standing in front of the flat files. I don't know if that's pointer or not.
But yeah, so after that, I mean, that's what we're doing in the back, and you guys are.
Yeah, and so while she was doing that, sort of after we heard the plaintive cries and the 3 of us went down, saw that something biblical was happening. I actually ran back out to our security office. And I mean, I think that was one of the things that was really lucky and helpful, being under the umbrella of Mother Emory, is I was able just to tell our security guard, we have a gushing flood in storage. And then I ran back to storage, and then security was able to call campus services and get that part of the response going for us while we could focus on the art.
Yeah, and that meant that when our team got back there, we really didn't have to worry about immobilizing anything else. We were able to concentrate on what was happening in storage. We didn't know how long the water was going to stream in, and we didn't know if it was going to continue through the night. So as Andy continued with Liz Schulte to rescue boxes from lower shelves and essentially raise the level at which the artwork was stored, Annie and I turned our attention to the one cabinet that was immediately underneath the gushing hole in the wall. And that cabinet we couldn't move. It was very full of objects. It did not have room for a forklift or a dolly to go underneath it to physically lift the whole cabinet. So the quick response was to empty out the drawers.
And that's actually what you're looking at here in this picture. Those are drawers from that.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
And so we pulled the drawers and we started bringing them to the lab. We had a little bit of overflow into the hallway as well. And then Renee and I just focused on rescuing any of the metals that were swimming, drying out the drawers, and then assessing the boxes. So, what was wet, what needed to be thrown away, what could be kept. And so that was our immediate concern, was rescuing
And
any
for
of the
the 2 of
metals.
us, that project went on until about 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
We just kept pulling drawers and then sorting through the drawers. So if objects were wet, we took them out of the drawers and we dried them with paper towels, and then we left them on spread around the benches of the lab. We then threw away those saturated boxes. If the drawers were not wet, we left the objects in them and we began to use them as stacking. So we had little bunk beds of objects in the drawers around the lab. Once we had exhausted all the table space, we went back to the empty drawers, began to dry them out and put objects back into those drawers. As you can see in this picture, all of our metal objects are stored in individual archival wooden boxes. They're all, archival paper boxes. They're all numbered and padded, and this facilitates their handling when they're examined in classes in particular, and isolates them in their storage drawers. That was really handy when we went to move them, because everything was individually grouped or sectioned. And then when we got back to the lab, our intention was to keep all this for the future, but obviously many of the boxes were saturated. So as Annie said, we were able to throw away the ones that were immediately kind of discard to the side those that were saturated. The few we hoped we could revive in the future, we laid out to dry, and then we separated the metals from their sort of wet environment.
Yeah, and so while we were doing that, our security was handling campus services responses, and Todd and one of our design team, Bruce, had the really lovely job of sorting through all of the archival material that was sitting on top of the microclimate that had been directly in the stream of the water. And so they got to throw a lot of really soggy board away. And that was an unpleasant work. It's unfortunate that we lost that much material, but if we had to lose something, we'll
Yeah.
sacrifice the
Yeah, we'll
boxes.
throw away the archival
yeah,
boxes for sure.
yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and so that gets us to, as we said, the initial response kept us busy until about 8 p.m.
Oh, it kept us busy
that evening.
later than that.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
So
it
this gets us to
did.
8 p.m.
Yeah.
And so then at 8 p.m., the majority of us finally decide that we've done enough and are exhausted, and that's enough for day one. And so most of our crew goes home except for one lucky individual.
What I did is I actually coordinated with security and campus services because campus services brought in dehumidifiers. And, they're the big industrial ones with the hose that goes to, in our case, the trash can. And the trash cans have to be emptied. And because it's our object storage, it's a secure space, we can't just have anyone going in there. And so I volunteered for some reason to be the one that would come in during the middle of the night to empty those. So I went home for a little bit, went to the bar, fortified myself, and then came back with my pillow at about 12:30 at night. And then luckily I didn't have to empty any of them. To be honest, I wasn't actually needed because there wasn't quite as much water being sucked out as we had feared. But having just survived this, I was unwilling to just let it go unsupervised. So I checked in once about 12:30. I slept on my office floor, checked in again around 2, and then finally went home after that.
But we also didn't know if it was going to storm again.
Right.
Right.
So although
That's
campus
a good point,
services
yeah.
had come in with dehumidifiers and shop vacs, and so all the standing water had been sucked up, and what was now saturating the air was being dried out by the humidifiers, and we'd gotten all the wet material out that we could.
It was supposed to rain again.
Yeah, it
so-
could have poured again, and the hole was still open. And this, by now, we understood was a 4-inch wide hole in the wall, and it was draining essentially everything that ran off of the roof of the building directly into our basement. So we'll get there. But
Yeah.
to say that we didn't know if it was going to rain again.
Yeah.
All right, so that gets us through day and night number one.
Mhm.
Yeah, we have a question already.
So when you were pulling stuff out of the cabinet, was the water gushing down on you?
No, it had stopped. Basically, the water ran until about 5:20, and that was when finally it stopped. And so, unfortunately, though, we'll get on this a little bit later, but as the water was literally slamming down and drumming on the top of the cabinet, it was an older cabinet and the latch is not secure on that one anymore. Even though it was a gasketed cabinet and theoretically airtight, there was so much pressure hitting the top of the cabinet and the latch was no longer secure that it actually forced the cabinet open. It shook the doors open. And so we made the call that we just basically have to get the stuff out of there, even if we get a little wet in the process, in lieu of getting it a whole lot wetter.
And you and Bruce had managed to, and that's what the first part of the video before I fall is you and Bruce kind of shimmying that cabinet away from the wall and away from the direct water. So I think technically the water was still trickling in, but we had gotten the cabinet enough sort of away from the source that we were able to start pulling them, but not pulling them with water actively coming down on us or the
But
objects.
some of them were already wet because the cabinet doors
Right.
had come open and water had gotten in.
Right.
Okay, well, and so I realize here with this slide on the left, I have actually put this one a little bit ahead of where it belongs, so we'll use it as a segue. So we've gotten through one day. This was Monday, so now we're on to Tuesday. And so Tuesday begins with, I think the first thing we did was to begin clearing works on paper or storage content. And so what you're looking at here in this photograph is we basically looked for all of the low-hanging fruit in our works on paper storage area. And so we grabbed the heavier Solander boxes and heavier archival boxes, easy things to grab and transport. And so what you're looking at here in the picture on the left is us loading Solander boxes into the back of our van to transport to our offsite storage facility.
And we started with WAP because that's obviously the collection that's most in danger from any sort of environmental water. But Tuesday, it was still unclear precisely what the cause was and
Right.
what was going to have to happen now that this did. So Tuesday morning, we were in a little bit of a limbo period as to how much was going to have to be evacuated.
And I should say
ultimately.
that by Tuesday morning, well, really by Monday evening, all of the water had been cleared up off of the floor. So there was no longer standing water in the space, but we all knew that there had been water standing long enough in the space that it was going to cause mold problems or similar things.
I'm very proud of the space, though. It never got above 57% humidity.
That is true.
So.
All right, so now we move to our second day. So we started moving, one crew of us has begun moving cylinder boxes to our offsite storage in order to clear off some of the shelving units in our works on paper storage area, because we had intentions to use the works on paper storage shelving, which is that Metro chromed wire restaurant shelving. And you see some of it now being used here. So I will turn it over to others to talk about our temporary storage in the second phase.
So I think by Tuesday morning, we anticipated that there would be some kind of a demolition response, even if that hadn't, that wasn't actually confirmed until later Wednesday. But it was looking more and more like we were going to have to move more of the collections out of the space. And so I think there was a trip perhaps to offsite storage to bring some shelving back and put it on the third floor, and then the wire racks. Okay, and the wire racks were moved into our temporary holding space on the plaza level. And so we started to move.
Sorry to interrupt you. And what you're looking at here are photographs of that storage racking in our temporary holding storage area on the ground floor, and then the next slide will be the similar setup in our photo studio. Sorry.
So in teams of two teams of two, I would think roughly. And it's funny because we were sort of isolated in some ways after we had, mobilized each of our teams. Jessica, myself, and our third year intern at the time, our third year graduate intern, Michaela, chipped in, as did Annie, over the course of that day. And I think the next morning, we started by moving all the drawers from our small artifact storage, lining one of the walls, and then moving it to the wire racks in that temporary holding space. At some point, somebody came up with a brilliant idea to put pieces of blue sticky tape on the drawers, because we had 4, 6 perhaps of that drawer storage, and of the ones that we could move, there were multiples of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so somebody had the genius idea to actually put the cabinet number on each of them. And so
with the intention of basically,
thank God,
if we had the need to quickly find any piece of artwork that was normally housed in those drawers and normally housed in a different room from the one that they're in at this moment, there would not have been time to do collections inventory data entry at that point. So we could at least say, okay, it used to be in drawer J5, there's the sticky for J5, we can find a piece.
And so at some point during the course of that day, we then turned to all of the larger 3-dimensional objects in our collection. And by the time we'd started moving things, there was enough shelving on the 3rd floor. Are we there yet?
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Which luckily for us, we didn't actually have a temporary exhibition on our 3rd floor exhibition space, which we often do. But this was at the end of our what was typically our spring exhibition. And so we were using it as a swing space for another upcoming reinstallation, for Engineering East reinstallation. So we had this large space, and we cobbled together some tables, some other storage racks that we were able to put up. And we just went through cabinet by cabinet and moved all of the objects cart by cart up to the 3rd floor. We decided that the quickest route to avoid the public was directly across from our plaza level storage area through the Carlos Museum, which is the Carlos Hall, which is the academic side of the building where the art history department is housed. So we
that would be the elevator they were using.
That was the elevator ride. We were getting a little punchy by the end of the day.
Yeah.
And that was on the way back down, I will note. So there were no objects harmed in the making of that.
Yeah.
And so cart by cart, we just moved everything up to the 3rd floor. Through that back, there's an emergency exit from that 3rd floor exhibition space. So we moved it into the elevator up to the 3rd floor, and this also actually required additional guards to be stationed there, because it was an emergency exit for them to open it for us, because it really wasn't ideal to prop it open since it was still a museum space.
And they were really helpful.
They were
sort of helping us with the logistics of moving everything.
They were wonderful.
And we should say, during all of this, we were in normal operation. So there were members of the public walking through other parts of the museum, and we like to hope had no clue as to what we were up to. But I suspect that one or more of them had one of these moments as they saw us cruising by with artwork here and
Well,
there.
I think you're probably right that as sort of frantic as we were behind the scenes, it didn't necessarily show to the public.
Yeah.
Because not all of the guards knew. You know, if the guards had been working in classical, they were like, wait, did something happen? So I think that's a kudos to us for pulling that off.
For being calm enough.
Yeah.
So in general, we tried to keep the objects sorted by collections area, but as space became tighter, we had to pack them in as closely as we deemed safe, and so there were some stray objects in other parts, and as things started to populate the shelves, we realized, okay, well maybe we need to start moving these objects towards each other, and then moving these from this table over here, and eventually everything got moved.
Yeah.
We should probably
You
also,
wanna talk about
well,
some paper?
yeah, just real quick. One of the things that I forgot to mention was that first night, as we were staying there pretty late, when we were wrapping all of the shelving units. And I mean, it doesn't sound like that would be very difficult, but it really was.
Well, and just for to visualize, basically similar units like these, full of Solander and or archival cardboard boxes. And a number of them we saw as the opportunity to get units clear so that we can repurpose them to stack the drawers in, but the remainder stayed in place and wrapped.
Yeah, so we wrapped them. We were also worried about the humidity, and then the humidifiers taking too much humidity away. So there was that issue too. We weren't sure if maybe more water would come in again, so we had to get everything completely covered. But yeah, so we prioritized I guess the biggest shelving units
Basically.
to be emptied. Do you want me to keep going there, or you want to go forward?
Have it?
Okay. So we prioritized the biggest shelving units to get the Solander boxes off, so that they could be repurposed upstairs. In order to maintain some semblance of order and how the collection was shelved, we again used the blue the painter's tape. You'll see that in a lot of the images here. And I just recorded, what shelf each box was on, tagged each shelf because they're different dimensions, with the number, so that when it went upstairs, hopefully eventually, this didn't necessarily happen, it would come back down and we would know exactly what shelf, once everything came back, each Solander box was supposed to go on, just to keep everything as much together as we could.
It was insanely helpful because we cleared all of our on-site storage, WAP, and 3D objects in 2 days.
Well, and I think and we'll get into a little bit more of this as we sort of wrap out talking about what we've learned. But I think it's an important thing to bring up at this point that we chose to handle this as an in-house operation. So we did this with our own staff, and we tried to contain as much of the material to a single building as we could. We could only have that option available to us because of the fact that, as was said previously, we did not have an exhibition in the largest of our temporary exhibition galleries, and so we were able to secure it with a door and use it for this temporary storage. But that very rarely happens as an opportunity. So, were it any normal situation in the museum's world, that gallery would be full of artwork and not available for this purpose. And so then we would be looking at contract art offsite storage probably, and having to work with art movers in order to do that. And so we were fortunate in that way, in that we had the space available to us, and all it took was gangs of people going home exhausted at the end of each day. Anything else we want to say about the immediate response? Any questions so far? Oh, yeah.
Can you talk about your communications, like on day one? Who notified the director and the staff and the docents who the volunteers who then couldn't show up the next day to do their conservation work?
Well, okay, so I made, knowing that we wanted to somewhat control communications to avoid panic and that sort of thing, we decided, I don't know if I decided it on my own or if there was some sort of committee that decided it, but we said, okay, I'll send the emails. So I sent the emails, and then basically Renee was in charge of the actual movement of the artwork. And so Renee and her folks made the determination as to what moved where. And then in essence, I was in charge of communication, and I was in charge of dealing with outside folks. So basically anyone who we were bringing in to help with things.
And I just lifted things.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and the rest of us were cheerful and moved things.
Mhm.
So, but and then I don't know that we actually made any communication outside of the museum, because it didn't impact our normal operation. We were still able to continue to do the things that we did. I mean, I assume that you guys had to tell your volunteers not to come one day or so, but
Maybe we might have put them to work.
but yeah, maybe
I think they did. I think they helped.
I think we
Yeah.
put them to work in the lab. And we didn't need to worry too much about internal operations or communicating with our staff because we were actually moving our collections through the adjacent building, as was described about the elevator with the folks in it. That's actually in the other side that belongs to the art history department. And so we were moving in that elevator, which is a public elevator, but it's not on the museum side where it impacted school groups needing to go through. We could essentially secure that elevator for our use. So that actually also helped limit the need to disseminate to everyone. There's an emergency response
Right.
going on because it was sort of happening completely behind the scenes.
And another point of that is that elevator had a very direct connection to this area where the artwork is being stored through that emergency exit door. And so truthfully, the only people who could have seen what we were up to would have been people standing in one area of the art history department building. And it was the summertime.
And
They
it was
weren't sitting
summer.
there.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
summer. Although we did have to notify
Absolutely.
the folks in art history.
Well, they
which-
also
yeah.
flooded. so-
Yeah, the Lyman Center, the Graduate Student Center flooded and
Yeah.
had to get lots of stuff replaced. So that was also being,
immediately adjacent to your
Right.
storage.
right.
And they actually are the lowest point in that sloping run of rooms. So the graduate student work area in the art history department was actually the worst flood.
Mhm. It was.
All right. So now we move into, okay, we've gotten ourselves to a place where we can all exhale. We can all relax a little bit. Things are now able to move forward. And so at that point, then the remediation contractor came through, working with campus services. We moved all of the remaining furniture out of the space once all the artwork had been cleared, obviously. That went to a temporary storage area. And then the remediation contractors came in initially to assess potential mold damage, and then once that work had been completed, to make repairs. And they ultimately did determine, although I don't know that they determined a mold outbreak, they determined that there was plausible likelihood that mold could result as a result of the wall board at a certain height being damp for long enough. And so they made the decision to come through the entire, and unfortunately I don't have photography of this, but made the decision to come through the entire sequence of spaces and remove all of the gypsum board drywall at a 3-foot height. And so basically throughout the spaces, they made essentially wainscoting of a big hole in the wall that ringed all of the spaces. All of that came out. They removed all of the flooring. In the process of the flooring coming up, there was some concern that the mastic might have been asbestos bearing. So then it became not only a mold situation, but a potential asbestos abatement. And the entire area became plastic draped, and we were asked to stay out for obvious reasons. And so that process went on basically with staff having no access to the storage areas for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Sound about right? At which point they then started asking us to come back in to look at the situation and make recommendations as to what wanted to be done. And so we'll come back to this one, but basically this is what the spaces look like after the remediation. So same spaces you were looking at previously, full of mud. At this point, all of the tile and baseboard has been replaced. The wall board up to 3 feet of wall has been replaced. And then there is a fresh coat of paint on everything. And that carries it through all of the spaces. And then actually there were some subsequent repairs that happened after this photography was taken. That if you can see it there, that strange looking horizontal piece of pipe in the image on the left with a little piece of blue tape on the end of it. And then if we go back to the slide before, this box, they were both dealt with after this point. We were able to get campus services to come in and not only make the immediate repairs, but also to assess the space to sort of look at what can we do in the future to keep this sort of thing from ever happening again. And so there was a fair amount of assessment of what the source of the water was, and even not just the source of the water for this one particular event, but could there be other potential sources of water? Let's deal with it properly all at once. And so, yes, this would be our culprit. So this is up high on the wall, and you can see it in that photograph on the left there. It's up high on the wall. That is an exterior wall. And so this is an exterior wall facing the university's quadrangle. And where that yellow hosing goes out is about 2 feet below grade. So it's very close to the ground. And so what we determined, what folks determined as a result of all of this project, was that this was in fact an open penetration of our building, again, hole of this diameter that had been bored into the building at some point in the late 1980s or early 1990s. And it is a series of lines for network cabling and telecom. The ironic thing is actually only one of those lines was actually still in use at the time that the event happened. The rest of them were all vestigial from technologies past. But the unfortunate thing is that the folks who apparently did this work originally did not seal the hole at all. And so what you had was you had 2 open penetrations into the building. One that has this piece of yellow accordion hose going through it, again, though not sealed. And then the other, a completely open penetration. You can actually see a little bit of light in the one on the left side. That is actually light coming in from the outside, right around the white caulking.
Yes, that's the quad.
That is the quadrangle, yeah. That's where they actually sneak little bits of food to us down in the basement. And so the ironic thing is that had been an open hole in the side of our building, we believe, for 25 to 30 years. In hindsight, we then, once we learned that information, recognized that actually it had probably been the cause of a repeated cycle of flooding. I should say that it is partially below grade, it was partially buried, and it is tucked under the eaves of the building. So it didn't leak that often, but when it did leak, we did, over a series of years, see evidence of it on the floor, but we could never point our finger on what the source was. And actually, there was a fair amount of work done starting in the early 2000s to dig a French drain on the exterior of the building with the idea that it might have been a foundation leak. We now realize that it was never a foundation leak and that it was actually water coming in through the side of the building. What actually caused this to happen, which we started on earlier, was so we basically had a super intense rainstorm. The gutter system on the exterior of the building is, in that section of the building, is more than 100 years old. It's inadequate and had not been properly maintained. There were gutter systems that actually ran underground into a big cistern, for lack of a better name, underneath the quadrangle, and actually was fed by a number of buildings on the quadrangle. And it had not been kept maintained. It was not clear. And so literally what happened is that backed up. There was enough pressure that when you actually, and unfortunately not the photograph of this, but when you actually viewed the downspouts from the building on the exterior of the building, you could see where they had been blown out. It looked like somebody had been inside the downspout punching their way out, and there were dents where the downspout blew out. And what happened was it actually exploded. It blew completely open, and essentially all of the water draining off that portion of the roof drained onto this and into our basement.
There is landscaping, as Todd said, it's partially below ground. There's landscaping there, which makes it hard to see. It's not like when you walk outside, you're like, oh, there's a hole, why don't they plug that? You know, it was actually, there was landscaping in front, and as the grade began to adjust, it actually began to slope back down toward the building. So the water, which did run off, just wanted to come in.
And there was a token little plastic cap on the end of the pipe. And I think that's possibly why with floods past, we never figured it out, because if you opened up the box, it looked capped,
Mhm.
you know, and I wasn't gonna, you know, jimmy a cap off, but that got blown off pretty quick in the flood.
All right. So now we move into the next phase, which is our construction work has been completed. What did we learn from this experience, and what adaptations did we make after the fact? So I can start with reference to this one photograph. Although promises were made up and down that we would never see water in this part of the building again as a result of all of the myriad repairs and adjustments that had been made, we are not so naive. And so we began looking into what could be done within the storage area, knowing that there was no way for us to choose not to store our artwork below grade. What can we do to improve the situation? You'll see, in the photograph on the left, the cabinets that are facing out toward you, the far away ones, have a little kick plate on the bottom. That actually, and some of you may be familiar with these, you pop the kick plate off and you have a pallet base that you can jack. The cabinet closest to us didn't always look that way. It actually, previously, and there are a number of them in the storage area, it's an older design, it sat directly on the floor with no ability to access it from underneath. And so the first thing that we did was to essentially create pallet bases for these cabinets that did rest directly on the floor. And we did it with HMMV plastic, which is called Tyvar in the trade. It's super hard, super crush resistant, and has a bonus in that it's slightly slick. So if you were to empty out one of these cabinets, you can push it across the floor and out with your bare hand, which is nice because, as we said, it'll happen again.
And also, before the cabinets went back, we had them evaluated for any rust concerns and corrosion, and so we took that opportunity to sort of check our cabinetry before it went back in.
Because with repeated flooding, there was rust on the bottom of the cabinets.
Yeah.
We knew this.
Did they finish?
Yeah, those that were any of them lost entirely, or they just
No.
they just refurbished the bottoms.
Yeah, they just and who knows, but the answer that we were given is that all the corrosion was essentially surface rust, and so it was sanded and they were primed, and we were told that that would be sufficient. Okay, well, so let's talk about how in this situation how luck served us. So as we mentioned it before, we had the luxury that one of our galleries was dark at the time and could be used as a storage area. That's the obvious one. Going back to the, and others please jump in here, but going back to the original event, the fact that the flooding event started essentially at 4:30 to 4:45 meant that there were some staff in the building. Had it been much later, there would have been no one here to recognize it happening, and we would have found it on Tuesday morning. The fact that we had in the building at 5 o'clock on a Monday, so for us, the fact that we had 2 registrars, 2 conservators, a curator, and a preparator at that point meant that we, and obviously the security staff, meant that we had a hope of actually dealing with it at that time. That would not normally have happened at 5 o'clock on a Monday. So that was lucky piece number 1.
I think what was also lucky about that was not only the initial response to getting the metals out of water, but since we actually saw what had happened, we were able to then communicate that to facilities. Because what's really weird about that flood is even, I saw where that water was gushing out of the wall. You saw the mud that came with it. But once it stopped coming in, the box was dry and clean. The wall was dry and clean. It wasn't clear that that's where the water had been coming out of. So I think in addition to saving the objects, for getting that repair done to the building, it was vital that we were here and could literally point and be like, it was right there. That's where it came
otherwise
out of.
you might think that it had just seeped in
Right.
because all the water went back to the back of Works on Paper, and that's where that 2-inch kind of puddle lake was. And I feel like they would have concentrated on that area rather than that hole.
Yeah.
And they had done so. Because
Right,
this is
previously,
not the
yeah.
first, maybe the dozenth time we've
Right.
encountered water in storage, so that it's become routine. I mean, Stacy, every time there's been a rainstorm, when you come
I
in
come
first
in
thing
and
in the
say,
morning, you go and check the water in
Yeah.
storage.
Flood
because we're
control.
so used to that being the case. But as Annie's saying, we never had the evidence because the wall wasn't wet, the hole wasn't visible, the little cap was still there, so we didn't know where it was coming from.
And I think another big piece of what was lucky for us is that previous to this event, we already had a building project approved. So our administration had already gotten funds approved from the university administration for an improvement project in this series of storage areas. So the project approval had already occurred. We were, though, toward the end of one fiscal year and didn't have cash in hand. We were fortunate in that the provost's office, who is to whom we report, recognized the situation, said, okay, instead of just bringing remediation contractors in to put you back to your steady state prior to the event, let's just go ahead and roll the two projects together and not just put it back to what it was, but put it to what we intended to be. And they allowed us to essentially borrow against next year's budget in order to do that work. And so actually, it was fortunate in that what we ended up with was a better situation than we started with, but it was pretty painful getting there.
Yeah.
I would recommend going about it in a different way. For years. Any more thoughts on luck? I can talk about how luck did not serve us. The obvious thing is that we've talked about previously is that the cabinet that was directly beneath the leak site did not have any kind of pallet base, was extremely heavy, so we could not move it, and it happened to have a bad latch, and it happened to be full of many thousands of years old ancient metals. So not the greatest thing to dump water on top of.
Better than the works on paper.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
it still could have been worse. It could have been worse.
But I will say, on the other hand, on Luck's side, none of those metals appear to have sustained any major additional damage, miraculously.
Yeah, we didn't make any claims for art. It
Well,
was
that-
it
yeah,
was
that-
just. I stole your thunder. Sorry.
That was the how it ends.
Oh, I'm
That we not do
sorry.
this whole
Spoiler
damn
alert.
thing without having to make a fine arts insurance claim.
Yeah.
They actually lost no art. Okay, so let's talk about then how our planning and/or processes prior to this benefited us. So I can start, and others please jump in. But number one, we are a small unit within a much larger system, much larger organization. Typically, that causes us anger and frustration. In this case, though, it did mean that we had other folks to call upon. And so, as has been brought up previously, Emory University Campus Services does have on-call crews 24/7 for weather disasters. And they were able to get into our building. There was a crew that was already working to assess the source of the leak while the leak was still going on. And there was a crew inside our building with high-capacity shop vacs within 20 minutes of when we began. And then, as others have said, the dehumidifiers showed up shortly afterward. But they actually were wanting to bring the dehumidifiers in before we were ready for them to do so. The other thing I note for planning is, as Renee has pointed out previously, the large majority of pieces in our storage area were, number one, in cabinets with latches that worked, in gasket sealed cabinets, ones with welded seams. So even had water risen higher than it had, we probably would not have been looking at a lot of wet cabinet contents. Added to that, most of the small objects were in drawers. Within those drawers, they were in trays, and within those trays, they were in individual tiny boxes. So it made the evacuation process much quicker for the small objects. We didn't have the luxury, obviously. Larger objects, you have to pick them up one by one. But the smaller objects, we did. And then, as has been previously said, with the exception of the cabinets that originally rested on the ground, everything within the space was stored at least 2 inches above the floor. So when the waters did rise, it did not get that much wet from below. It was just from above. Any more thoughts on how we planned and that made us wonderful?
Well, it didn't really end up serving us because of the volume of water, but right outside the storerooms are where we keep the emergency supplies for the institution. We do have emergency supply critical response materials on each level where we have collections, so each of the gallery levels, but this is the hub for the storage of our own shop vac, our fans, our sorbent pillows, our extra extension cords, all of the personal equipment that lives there. And the first thing we did was start trying to throw down sorbent socks and pillows to keep the water from coming out of storage and into the hallway. There was just no stopping it. It was more than we could contain with our stock of pillows. So we just kind of gave up and saved what we had because it wasn't going to serve us. But that was part of our planning, was to be prepared with the plastic on hand that Andy and Liz used to drape all of the cabinetry and mop. We had all that polyethylene plastic here. So everything was ready and waiting actually right outside this room, which was luck, planning, and then ultimately some of it didn't serve.
All right, well, so now let's flip it around and talk about how our planning or lack thereof failed us. So the things that I know and that has already been brought up in the conversation is that our artwork is stored in below grade areas. It's just a wonderful gift that museums tend to have, that they always put the storage areas below grade unless you have a purpose-built contemporary building, and water tends to roll downhill. The other thing, as pointed out previously, is that all of our cabinets, or many of our cabinets, did not have pallet bases, could not easily be moved, and had to be completely unloaded, slowing us down a lot. And then a big one too, which was obvious in the first set of slides, is that although our spaces are below grade, they don't have floor drains, and so there was nowhere for the water to go. And then another big one is that although there are affordable, easy to use, and easy to wire into our building security system water flow alarms that could have been deployed in our storage areas, we do not have them in our storage areas. So there, thank God there was somebody in the space, because there would have been nothing to alert anyone that there was water on the floor.
Because even if we had been here, if you hadn't been in storage with the door open,
Right.
we
We
wouldn't
would have never heard it.
we still wouldn't have heard it.
And then the other one that's obvious that people have pointed out already is that our storage areas are very small. They're very cramped. We use every square inch of them. And archival boxes and other storage and handling materials get shoved into every nook and cranny. Those nooks and crannies were the areas that got wet. So we ended up losing quite a lot of fairly expensive artwork handling supplies. And that was actually ultimately what the insurance claim was made for. We made an insurance claim for loss of property. And so we did claim the loss of all of that material and replaced it.
I'd also recommend flood shoes.
Yes.
This was
Will
a
do.
big thing.
Andy had a great list of takeaways. Do you want to go through some of them?
Well, please begin with the flood shoes,
Flood
because
shoes. I have since added them to my desk. I both have an extra pair of sneakers, and I brought in some welly rain boots. Because I tend to wear like little scuffy shoes that aren't super sturdy and
slippery.
And as we were discussing the other day, I don't know what was in that water, but nor did I think about it when I went in after the artwork.
Your instinct is to take your slippery shoes off.
Yes.
And walk barefoot.
Yes.
Through the raw sewage.
We don't know that.
We didn't know that.
It was mud.
Yeah. So flood shoes. That's my takeaway from this.
One of the things that was slightly alarming in retrospect, but not at all while it was happening, was that I didn't know what that box contained. We didn't know. Were they electrical wires? They could have been, but yet we're walking around in the water, touching the box. I mean,
Well, you were the guinea pig.
Yeah.
By the time I got there, I'm like, oh, she's still alive. It's fine.
I was still alive, so everyone knew.
But again, should this happen again, just take a moment. Take a second. Think about where you're sticking your body.
Yeah. It's a good lesson.
Yep.
Yeah. Thankfully, no one was electrocuted.
That's right.
What else did I say? Oh, well, one of the great things I think that we all learned about each other is nobody panicked. Everyone just immediately started doing what we could. And you know, stayed out of each other's way too while we were doing it and maintained a, you know, great attitude,
Yeah. I mean, I
relatively
think that,
speaking, you know?
that was one of the things we were really lucky is
Mhm.
that we're able to have a team of people. We're a team that works really well together and fortunately like each other.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, I think that was the thing with the response, both immediate and after, is we all just did our jobs.
Mhm.
And that's what kept everything moving in the museum, and that's what allowed us to evacuate storage so quickly. So if you're lucky enough to have a team, just trust your team to do their thing.
And to add to that, I was not actually on site when this happened. I was out that entire week, and I came back following Monday. And so when I came, I mean, people had been sending me real-time texts, so I knew what was happening, but I couldn't be here. But when I came back on the following Monday, I wasn't surprised because I know my coworkers very well, but I was very impressed with, particularly when I went up to the temporary exhibition area that was being used as storage. I was impressed at how, as we discussed in the office the other day, how purposeful it looked. It didn't look like a triage area. It looked, I mean, yes, there were some, you know, collections that were sitting together. Yeah, we had Americas with Near Eastern, but beyond that, it looked like it was an intentional storage area. Like there was no chaos up there. We had to go back through and do location updates on everything. But if someone had asked us for a specific object at the time, it would have taken us a little longer than usual to find it, but we could have found it. So I have to say I was very impressed with how well the response worked here. Although I will say in a lesson learned, what we should have done, we need to do it now because we haven't, once we finish putting our storage back together, we haven't quite gotten all the cabinetry back in, is take pictures of our storage area as upon putting it back together. No matter how well you think you know your storage area.
There's always that
Todd
one
and I have
cabinet.
both, yeah, Todd and I have both worked here a very long time. And at one point when we were trying to figure out where the cabinets needed to go back to, we both stood at my desk and we did through a little floor plan and we were sure we had 32 cabinets in storage. And then I went and looked in our database and I said, no, we have locations for cabinet 33. We have 33 cabinets. How did we get them all in there?
So yeah, pictures
take
before a
pictures of how your
disaster.
storage is set up before something like this happens.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, we don't hesitate to take photographs of artwork installation. That's a matter of course. We do it and it's very helpful. We know that if we ever have need to deinstall a case, we know exactly how it was installed and can immediately put it back to where it was. But no one ever thinks, oh, I'll have to put my storage area back to where it was, and so I have to document what it looked like.
Related to that, did you have in your plan, did you have a process for how you would evacuate your collections and keep track of them? And did that work? Yeah. Did you have to come up with it kind of on the fly?
Well, I mean, so we have an emergency evacuation plan. Is that what we call it?
Yeah.
Emergency response plan. But it basically it deals with evacuate. The thought process, and you can step in here, but I think the thought process behind our evacuation plan is less dealing with immediate threats and more dealing with that inevitable 48-hour notice before the hurricane comes. And so it's mostly built around what will we evacuate if we know that we cannot evacuate the building, but have 24 to 48 hours to get material cleared. Is that fair?
Yeah, so we have a lot of time spent identifying the location and access route for the most, whatever they are, significant objects in each area, and how you can find them and how you can get them out of their mounts and out of their cases and out of their cabinetry and what equipment you need and who can go in and what kind of equipment to carry it, but not the wholesale, we've got to move everything fast.
Right. And I think that's where we were sort of, I don't want to say winging it, but winging it a little bit, because it was like, okay, everything has to come out of these 2 rooms now. And that's,
well, the system, you know, the systems were pretty much developed on the fly, but luckily they worked really well. Just keeping track of where things were, keeping them together, and understanding where they might go back.
And that was one thing that we did, you know, there's no way we could have done location notes coming out, you know, in terms of like, oh, this landed on the 3rd floor on this cabinet. But Brittany mentioned it with the drawers, and you tagged the boxes in WAP, and you guys also put Post-its on the shelf upstairs as to where they came from. So that was sort of a little bit of a guide in terms of keeping track of the location of the objects, but there was a certain amount of trust that we just had to be like, okay, it's all got to come out. And then we'll sort of deal with where they landed after the fact.
Well, and one step necessitates the next. So as you were clearing shelving and that was being moved upstairs, that would then allow us access to certain parts of the collection. And your collection is organized in storage, thankfully, registrars. And so as you're evacuating, you're kind of following that path anyway. So as we were moving things up, it was almost organizing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, because we were clearing based on need. So one thing was cleared and then it was immediately put to use. And so there was a definite kind of, it necessitated a system and just became one.
Yeah.
But we I think to answer one of the questions is we did not have a pre-scripted plan saying, if you have to evacuate your storage area, first you clear off the works on paper shelves, then you move them to another area. We just figured it out as we went.
And we were lucky actually that the spacing of the cabinetry shelves, the ones in works on paper, worked nicely for the drawers that came out of our cabinets.
Just happened to work.
We didn't know that was going to be true. It was set for cylinder boxes, and it just sort of worked that we could put a single drawer or sometimes a stacked pair of drawers in that spacing, and it turned it in what used to be a shelving for cylinder boxes into a shelving for drawers, as if it were a drawer cabinet. But that was just luck. Wasn't part of the plan.
So then, we'll go back to the slide where it was before. So after the construction project was completed, we then began the process of moving our artwork back into the storage area. We did ultimately decide that a larger portion of the artwork than had previously been stored at our off-site storage area was going to continue to remain there. And so and you can say a little bit about your pieces there, but basically for the first time, not all of the works on paper collection now lives in the works on paper storage area on site. We elected to keep a portion of it off site, and then a larger portion of three-dimensional objects remained at our off-site storage and or were relocated there from the temporary storage area that we'd set up on the third floor. But the majority of it came back downstairs.
And part of that too was our own choice. It's like, okay, well, we already had to move things, so let's put things back the way we want. And so I think like with WAP and even the 3D objects, it was like, okay, this is our chance to give ourselves a little bit more space here.
And we the registrars worked with the curators all to basically say, okay, now that we have an unexpected, but nonetheless an opportunity to rethink some of our storage areas, could we look at what material you need to have on site versus what could live off site? And that's how we landed on that. So yeah, the storage areas are now mostly back to their normal position and disposition. They are a little bit more crowded than usual though, because as I had mentioned, we had already had a pre-approved construction project for our storage areas. That project continues today. And so the second phase of that project was to clear, demolish, and rework a room adjacent to this series of rooms that housed the majority of our textiles collection. And so what you're looking at here in these photographs is nooks and crannies in our three-dimensional object storage area that is now full of textile objects. You're looking at a temporary shelving unit that is normally, that space is normally occupied by an examination table, one that we bring students and faculty to, but now it's full of textiles and the table is folded up and put away. And so that work continues. So for that reason, although the flood response is now finished, it's still not normal in our storage areas.
It's hard to believe that it's already been 11 months and we're not back yet. But we're waiting, and we've got another couple of months before some furniture arrives in that adjacent room so that these objects can go back to their respective locations. And part of that, the continuing process for us in the lab is actually literally going on today, because as we left to come up here, some of our volunteers were reconstructing the storage boxes that were destroyed in the flood. And revising our housings of those metals and also consolidating some of those drawers that you saw with individual boxes in them. So remaking those, rethinking those has been an ongoing project, and that's work that we do primarily with volunteers. So it's continuing.
And just when you think you're finished, you're not.
Nope.
So always expect the next event because it has already happened.
Yep.
We have had yet another flooding event in this building, this time on the first floor of the building, so not the ground floor of the building, that has this year that has caused a closure of a portion of our Art of the Americas galleries. And so right now, again, within that same storage area down on the ground floor, we have cartloads of material that had to be deinstalled from our Americas galleries. And is currently still being stored there until we can complete repairs in the Americas galleries. I should say the cause of the leak in the Americas galleries was a different one. It was an HVAC systems failure. But we are still doing work to repair that. And right now the work is on hold until after Emory's commencement ceremony next Monday. And so then the work to the HVAC, or the repairs to the HVAC system will begin at that point. And then hopefully we will at some point be back to normal, whatever that is.
And I think Anne might have been the question earlier about communications. This newest event happened in public gallery spaces. We caught it in the morning before the galleries opened, but it was a museum open day.
It was, yeah. It was a Wednesday.
It was a Wednesday. And because we were going to be open to the public and we had to respond immediately within public operating hours, it was a much more visible response. There are temporary doors that have gone up in the doorways to those galleries. We had to put up signs. They had to put communications on our website explaining that some galleries are closed. And to the comment earlier that nobody panicked, we are used to this. We didn't panic. But there was a lot more panic because it was a publicly available event in this most recent occurrence. You know, we had more staff were involved because they saw it happening and were here because it wasn't 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, so we had a lot of offers for help of people in our development office, in our communications office, in our director's office. You know, how can I help? This is a disaster, and we're all kind of like, no, not a problem. We're used to this.
And
I think
Anne had asked about like the docents and the programming, and this is where they've been impacted actually, is with this latest flood, because obviously, you know, the docents were planning tours. Even summer camps now, which have been planned around the Ancient America galleries, are having to be tweaked. And but you know, luckily the education department is very crafty and resourceful, and so they've had to sort of tweak on the fly.
So this current one has had a lesser impact, I think, on us because the response was fewer objects. It wasn't as intensive. We don't have water standing everywhere, but it's been bigger impact on sort of the public side of the museum because it is the gallery space. I think it was more stressful for the institution in some ways.
I believe that's our program, unless others have anything to add.
Are you able to make a case to your administration for the purchase of water alarms?
We haven't started yet, but I mean, I think it would be pretty easy. The unknown bit, local alarms, you know, ones that just sound when they get wet, are a dime a dozen. I think though there'll be a little bit more cost involved in getting ones that are actually wired into our alert system, and I don't know that yet. So no, we haven't even started. But that is an obvious next step, and it's on our list.
And don't let them forget.
We have them on a couple of HVAC units for water collection pans under the units for when condensation collects. We've got those alarms. So it was actually kind of interesting to realize, wait, we never thought about collecting water elsewhere that we can have tied into our alert system. So nothing like an emergency.
So any questions? This is definitely wide open. Ask us. There are no stupid questions, and we won't tell you no. Yeah.
I don't have a question, but I work for Bell for which is remediation and do that kind of work or whatever. The document itself is stored or threw away. Still a paper document, or were they?
Oh no, by archival materials. We are not an manuscript archive. What we meant was archival storage materials. So basically cardboard boxes, mat board materials for handling the collection, not actually collection objects itself.
Well, there were some actual archival materials in works on paper, but it was just one box and it was easily removed from the floor and out of danger immediately. So.
I was gonna say that, maybe not the bad example, but a lot of situations where you can dry in place, so you're gonna have to move so much at one time or whatever, but each case is different. And like you said, clean water versus outdoor water.
Yeah.
The first picture I saw was somebody's toes, and I was like, oh, please let them say something about safety.
Yeah.
Somebody's shoes and that was.
Yeah.
Anyway, so.
Well, and the truth is, as has been said, it's not any of our jobs to worry about human safety, so we didn't. It's our job to worry about the safety of the collection.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that tells you need someone with a little more sense to say, hey, you could be poisoning yourselves here.
In fairness, I probably still would have gone ahead.
Yeah, yes, same here. I said that in my.
I mean, the electricity, that would have been.
Yeah.
But I was aware that I don't know what's in that water. But
Although at that point we knew it was rainwater.
yeah.
Like we've had other floods where we haven't been sure if it could be water from toilet lines, but this one we knew it was rain coming in.
Like the America's flood when we were in the galleries, when we were taking objects out, something splashed in my eye. And I was like, oh my God, what is that? So I think after the storage flood, I
more cognizant of it,
yes,
for sure.
Yes. So next time I will wear my glasses when I evacuate objects.
Can you talk about your emotional meter, your emotional health meter? So like day by day, like where were you at and how, still have a little PTSD?
You didn't bring your notes, Andy.
I did not bring I wrote a journal entry on day 3, curator's log, day 3, as I'm buried beneath plastic and cylinder boxes in the back. I probably should have brought it. It doesn't read coherently at all.
Yeah.
It was useful, but given the stressful nature of the situation, it was okay.
Yeah.
I think we all had our ways of dealing.
Yeah.
Well, I can say that day 2 of the flood happened on Monday or whatever.
Monday night.
And then the next day was actually my birthday. So my stress was alleviated because they all gave me a nice bottle of scotch.
Yeah.
But it was all in all a really good team effort. And I know that you guys moved a huge number of drawers, for like 2 or 3 days in a row. And everybody was tired at the end of the day.
Yeah, it was more physical exhaustion
Yeah.
than emotional
Yeah.
exhaustion.
Yeah.
Because we also, this was isolated to our storeroom. It didn't impact our personal lives. So we weren't being drained by what other crises were going on in the city that was underwater. It was
Right.
it was just storage. It was just our, it was our work. We all obviously care enough to go running in shoes and all, but it had an isolated parameters around the stress of the event, and we all were in it together. And we, as Annie said, we are a team that pulls well together. So we were fortunate in that.
And I think it's important too, a piece of it is that we recognized at a pretty early stage that we were not looking at a situation where our collection was being destroyed.
Right.
We knew that, okay, collection's okay, and now we can actually get to how do we get the spaces to a place where the folks can come in and make their repairs and do their work and allow us to still continue with our operation. So I think the emotional toll for some of us would have been a lot greater had we been looking at wrecked collections and, oh my God, where do you start?
Right,
in this case, it was obvious where you start because, as has been said before, we knew that in order to get this piece moved, you had to have that shelf clear, therefore that's where you start. And so that kind of kept us moving and kept the sequence going. But the groups that, to the extent that we could, we had little powwows throughout the day, each day, and kept each other aware of who was doing what. And when it was clear that the physical or emotional exhaustion was getting a little too much, someone jumped cruise and would do something else that day. So that's just how we did it. Nobody had to do the same thing.
I was saying the lab volunteers brought us cookies, so that helped too. No, it definitely. I think it was more physical.
Yeah, it was
than anything else.
Yeah.
So no,
because we moved one box at a time.
Not yet. We don't have PTSD next yet.
Yeah. I just remembered too that it was in that weird time after you finish your dissertation before you
Yes.
defend it for me. So it was, my head was elsewhere. And then when this happened, it was, you know, it was a distraction that really
Right.
like you could be passionate about,
Yeah.
you know, not have to think about this other part of your life that you've been obsessing over for years. Yeah.
Thinking more of an emergency response plan from the University of Alabama at Birmingham.
Mhm.
We have several library locations. Our archives is on the 3rd floor, but we have some storage on campus, and they just did a alarm, fire alarm test, and they tested, I guess, the sprinkler heads. So we had to go and put plastic over everything. Unfortunately, 2 of those heads failed.
Oh.
But we've had issues, like I said, with HVAC systems, older buildings, and they leak down, so we had plastic available. But really just thinking of, if you could give us some information on what we do in case we did have one of those leaks. So like the HVAC systems, we got that pretty much covered. But when they did the fire alarm test, that's something that we had no idea would fail.
Right.
We just covered things with plastic just to be safe. And then 2 of those heads started leaking. And so we had to get people in to fix the leaks, but nothing was damaged. So we did have some of those things that got damaged. What would be the process? What would we go next? You know, how we, I talked to our dean who was speaking about it, that some of the rare artifacts got wet, that we couldn't just dry them. He's saying there's a special process that, you know, they would, he said even freeze some of them and take them to some. So is there like some information that we can get that we can have an emergency process set up so we would know? So that's, I know there's a lot of information.
No, it's a great.
We have at least one response contractor in the
There's
room.
a lot of stuff on our website.
Yeah.
Seen it with the brochures, but and go to our website and there's, yes,
Okay.
got one. And there's some resources there, and a lot of it kicks you out to other places that have resources.
There's a lot of resources.
A lot.
The library department. And more, we're sitting right here.
Right.
And I was gonna say that if you're a book or an artifact that people don't have with, and you don't have freeze dry chamber right off right there, where you're taking stuff to have a relationship. You know, they have freezers and things like that. We always tell people don't open the books right away, but then after going to bed again, it's always do. I saw where people did lay out stuff and let it not dry, stuff like that, but really to dry again, all the stuff in place. We did one, Emory, it was the opposite, and I don't know that later than it, but we took just a section of the library and created kind of a chamber to dry the books or whatever, because it came overhead from the it was overhead. So we did all the drying with the equipment and dehumidifiers and stuff, but we also created a bunch of those books that got pretty wet and they dried out, you know, just fine, created our own chamber right there. So if it's not a humongous job, then we have freeze drying chambers, a humongous job, it's something smaller, people get wet, what have you, then the communication company to sell for it and create chambers right on site.
I'll check it just for
Well, I'll also plug, there is a number on here, and you do have an incident, and you're talking about preparing for something, but I think you did exactly what.
Yeah.
I would say that, your instincts are good. But this is the National Heritage Responders, and it's a 24-hour hotline, so if you do have an incident, and you're not sure what to do, you can call them, and they can walk you through it and get you information.
They could find regional, local people, so
They'll call people like us.
there's 4 of us in the state, in Georgia, and I'm not sure there's any in Alabama, but here in Birmingham. Yeah. But you've got, I mean, we're closer than we are in Atlanta than somebody who's down in Valdosta.
You know.
Yeah. You got resources.
Get some questions over here.
I was wondering if you all changed anything, like preemptively, like relabeling the cabinets with the locations, the drawers, or like putting stuff like in plastic bags instead of boxes or anything like that to perhaps protect it if there was another major incident.
That's a
It's a good question.
That's
Yeah.
a good question.
From our collections manager, we haven't made the decision yet about how we're gonna label going forward.
Yeah, well, we haven't finished that because we haven't gotten all the
We're not back
cabinetry in
in.
yet, so all the numbers and everything is going to change. But yeah, once we, and I need to update this and work on paper because as you can see in some of the earlier photographs, the blue tape is still on the boxes, but all the numbers of the cabinets and works on paper have since changed. So we actually need to update those. But my thought had been just to leave the blue tape on there in case we needed to do this again. And pretty much the same for the drawers that got moved as well, was just, they're already on there. We might as well just leave them in case we have to do this again. But no, we hadn't really thought about putting things in plastic bags just because I don't think I think
our objects are accessed regularly
Yeah.
for teaching, and so it would actually involve more handling and risk in the end to have them in bags. So we typically don't keep things in bags, even in a preventive way.
But the boxes really worked well because then, as somebody pointed out earlier, when you do have to move the box, you're handling the box, not the object. So it's less handling for the object. And it also made it easier for moving the whole drawers down the hallway where objects were not going to crash into one another. They were in the boxes, so they were isolated from one another.
And I think in this particular case, it was the cabinet that failed us, not
And that
necessarily the
cabinet is being
boxes.
replaced.
Yeah, and it's going to be in a permanent timeout now. I mean, I'm sure there's some other emergency that will, happen, but just thinking about the ramifications of this one, it was more of a cabinet failure than an individual housing failure.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention too that in numbers, certainly the majority of the three-dimensional collections do live in cabinets, and so they are getting some protection from water in that case. But obviously, the works on paper collection are just in solder boxes and open shelving, and then the larger pieces are sitting on open shelving as well. So.
And some of our upper open shelving, we do just leave draped in plastic.
You can see a tail of a piece of plastic in this one here. So we basically put plastic drapes over the boxes that are on the top shelves with the idea that if we had a sprinkler failure or something else, that at least it would convert it and push it off on the floor. Yes?
On that same line of questioning, you mentioned your supplies. So after all of this, is there something you've added to your supplies that you didn't have in there before because you thought it might be useful for the next time?
That's a good question.
Not yet.
But yeah.
Not yet. Right?
Individual flood boots.
Just
Right,
boots.
yeah, and we might add those. I mean, one of the things right after we created the disaster plan, emergency response plan, is we had only a small amount of supplies, and sort of each year for maybe 5 years after we created it, we kind of met and we're like, what do we want now? Oh, let's buy some more extension cords, and oh, we need some goggles, and we kind of amassed a lot in a very intentional way, and we haven't revisited that in a few years because our supplies have been pretty stable and we've kind of got our wish list, and I don't think we came up with anything that we would have wished to have, but part of that's because the big team came in from Emory with their fancy dehumidifiers and shop vacs, but we already had a small shop vac and a couple of dehumidifiers of our own, and then some turbo fans for the floor. So we had what we might need for a smaller scale event. The boots might be a good idea.
Well, and it's important though that I don't think that there was any piece of equipment or material that, we had one of those, we only had But I think it's important that although we did do a lot of work in creating and coming to the list of emergency supplies and equipment that we wanted to keep on hand, an important piece of that is that you have to replenish it as pieces are used. And unless you have it all tied down and hidden away, people will steal things as they walk by because they're too lazy to go and actually get it from where it belongs. And part of that replenishment process is not only are you replenishing your plastic and your tags and things like that, but during the response or at some point during the operation, we had 2 of those tornado carpet drying fans in addition to a shop vac and dehumidifiers. And so the dehumidifiers had already been pulled out of our space to deal with a problem in an off-site storage area for furniture, for exhibit cases and things like that. So those should have been replaced. They weren't. So we did not have dehumidifiers at hand. But luckily there were heavy duty commercial grade ones available from the university. And during the response effort, one of the carpet drying fans disappeared. And so that one is now gone. We don't know where it is. And we thought that our shop vac had also disappeared during the response. We actually discovered it in a storage closet recently, but only very recently. So it's an important thing that, you make sure you have the right list of things, but they do get used, and they walk and make sure that all those things that are on your list really are actually there. Yeah.
I was gonna say, if y'all do a lot of your own, like small jobs too, I would add a moisture to your collection, just so that, if it touches drywall or what have you, if you're gonna do the fans and do the pattern, you can just check the walls and stuff to make sure it's dry.
Yeah.
Emory comes in with that.
Cold spaces and things. But a moisture meter, we did jobs where people had and they were behind us. Their own readers. This wall is wet, and then you know how far the water travels and stuff like that. So that could be a good thing to add. If you're gonna be doing it yourself.
Yeah.
It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thoughts on what? Yeah, well, I mean, that was why they cut out all the wallboard. Is that the thought was, okay, so you kept your relative humidity in check, but knowing that
This is not the first flood.
Yeah, number one, this is not the first flooding event, and number two, that the drywall in the area remained wet for a number of hours. They just preemptively removed all of it. Metal, they were metals. Yeah, so.
A few cardboard boxes,
The cardboard boxes were thrown away.
And the few that we had, a splash of water on them, we tried and then evaluated whether they were too distorted or, too ugly. But nothing had time to mold.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, between the renovation
I don't know. Yeah, I know in archival materials, in boxes and board and things like that, we lost something on the range of $4,000 to $5,000 worth of material, but the construction project was at a $0+, I'm sure, for that one room. I know what the overall budget for the entire project that was approved, but as we said, we segmented that repair off, and I know what had been budgeted for the upgrades to that room. I have no idea what the actual cost of the remediation was. That was ultimately paid for with the insurance claim.
The renovation didn't include the hazmat remediation, right?
No.
They didn't anticipate that, so that's just all on me.
Yeah, that all went under the insurance claim. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Because, some people, when they have a disaster, they're kind of like, we didn't want to.